Blessed is our God at all times, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. O Lord our God, who bowed the heavens and came down for the salvation of the human race, look down on your servants and on your inheritance. For your servants have bowed down their heads and bent their necks to you, the judge, both awesome and loving. They do not await the help that is from man, but look for your mercy and are ready to receive your salvation. Guard them at all times this evening and tonight, against all enemies, against the devil's assaults, against vain thoughts and evil dreams. May the might of your kingdom be blessed and exalted, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Becky, I'll leave it to you to welcome our professor this evening.
Thank you, Father. Our speaker this evening studied the Catholic liberal arts at Thomas Aquinas College in California, graduating in 2002. An Ottawa native, Sean Fitzpatrick is currently the assistant headmaster and a teacher at his other alma mater, Gregory the Great Academy in Pennsylvania, a boarding school for boys offering a classical liberal arts education in the Catholic tradition, one that is fully lived and not just studied in the classroom. At the academy, he teaches literature, humanities, and drama, and leads the boys in many other enterprises to discover the true, the good, and the beautiful, in contrast to what is on offer by our society today. His writings on education, literature, and culture have appeared in a number of journals, including Crisis Magazine, Catholic World Report, the Epoch Times, and the Imaginative Conservative. Sean lives in Scranton with his wife, Sophie, and their 7 children. Please welcome this evening to the Institute of Catholic Culture, Sean Fitzpatrick.
Welcome, Professor. Such a blessing to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Father, and thank you, Becky, and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on tonight to talk about Mr. Sherlock Holmes and the Catholic cultural interest he provides as one of the quintessential gentleman heroes in all literature. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about the scary distinction between a scholar and a nerd, but I have. And I'm pretty sure I'm firmly in the nerd category, but I hope I will still manage to present something tonight that's a step beyond the trivial and the esoteric, I hope. But even that word, hope, reminds me of Sherlock Holmes's original name, Sharonford Hope. Perhaps after the Arctic whaler, the Hope, where Holmes's creator first shipped as a surgeon. I'm not sure why the name was changed, but it was. And our great detective was finally named after a cricket player with the surname Sherlock, though there was a prominent violinist by the name of Alfred Sherlock, and also the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. So sports, music, law, well, there it is. Let's hope I can move beyond such obscurities tonight. I'll just assume the motto of Holmes's firm, as presented in The Adventure of the Creeping Man: we can but try. And so can I. I will try. Though I may be a nerd, I am certainly an amateur scholar in the study of Sherlock Holmes, and I focus there on the root of that adjective, amateur, love. For really, to know these stories and characters is to love them. And any and all of the digging and delving and deducting into the world of these writings is born of a great love for something good that is in them, something deeply and purely good, just as the good motivates the men that live within these stories. And I say live because there are few characters who live only in books who are as alive as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. They are really characters who practically walk the earth. And that's the thing. Part of the reason for the mysteriously enduring effects of these mysteries is that they really resonate with something like firsthand experience that can be entered into. They possess this unique atmosphere that imparts a strong illusion of reality, rendering characters more tangible, crimes more terrible, and conclusions more triumphant. The overall result is that the stories of Sherlock Holmes conjure up a viable world for themselves with a scintillating iconography, and we all know it: the fireplace, the armchairs, the pipe, the revolver, the violin, the Persian slipper, creeping fog, rushing hansom cabs, the outre, the expose, stiff corpses, subtle criminals, so the tableau runs, framing this snug universe of danger and delight, allowing readers to enjoy the intrigues and the innocence of a bygone Victorian era, when chivalry was not dead yet and fellowship conquered all. Of course, everyone knows who Sherlock Holmes is. He is, perhaps, the most famous person who never existed. In fact, so deep is his footprint that some even think that he did exist. He's the only fictional character that I know of who has several scholarly biographies, which is really extraordinary. His name is a byword, his fame is universal, his career legendary. His rooms are located at a real address, 221B Baker Street in London, and you all know the iconic silhouette with the deerstalker cap and the calabash pipe. Elementary, my dear Watson. But did you know that nowhere in the sacred writings is a deerstalker mentioned? Further, the clay churchwarden was a clear preference of the Baker Street sleuth, and his other pipes included a cherry wood and a briar, no calabash. As for the immortal quote, elementary, my dear Watson, the sentence never appears in the canon, not once. The word elementary is spoken by Mr. Holmes in closest conjunction to his saying, my dear Watson, in The Adventure of the Crooked Man, where they are separated by no less than 52 words. So there it is. Sherlock Holmes, I'm getting to say here, is a classic example of one conquered by his own greatness, reduced by the height of his clout into a cliche. Everyone recognizes him, but knows little of him. Few have had a proper introduction to the master. And the only proper introduction to Mr. Holmes is by meeting him with Dr. Watson. And the only place to receive that introduction is in the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, when a 27-year-old Scottish physician who is struggling to make a living penned A Study in Scarlet, Arthur Conan Doyle, and in doing so, he made a fateful decision, which was intended simply to pay the bills, but ended up enriching the whole world. With A Study in Scarlet appearing in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887, the stage was set for what would prove one of the greatest characters in the history of literature. But does anyone really know Mr. Holmes? Anyone with a nodding acquaintance of Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street can say something about his violin, or his magnifying glass, or his chemical laboratory, but what of his beating corpses in the morgue to see how long bruises can be produced after death? What of his indifferent ignorance of the whole solar system, which poses a wild contrast to his arch nemesis, Professor James Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime, who is best known professionally as the author of The Dynamics of an Asteroid? Or what about Holmes's silent, brooding depression, his drug use, his back alley agents, the Baker Street Irregulars, his expertise in the eclectic Victorian martial art, Bartitsu, or how about his religious and chivalric implications, areas that we will touch upon tonight. Once the simplification engendered by his popularity lifts like a London fog, Sherlock Holmes emerges as a figure of astonishing complexity, and his very first recorded mystery is more about a man than a murder. And Dr. Watson is the detective who finds himself on the trail of another detective. After suffering a gunshot wound in the Battle of Maiwand, whether in the leg or the shoulder is disputed, Dr. Watson arrives in London to recover. The Bollard Army doctor soon takes up rooms at 221B Baker Street with an extraordinary fellow he meets by happenstance. Before long, Watson becomes bent upon unlocking the secret of the character he has taken diggings with, conjecturing that a revelation of Holmes's character will further disclose his occupation, which is the only thing more mysterious than the man himself. The Baker Street rooms are constantly being visited by policemen, weeping women, seedy ruffians, and whatnot, all filling Watson with a temptation to betray his English delicacy and asking, what on earth is going on? As he is repeatedly asked, with English grace, to make allowance for his companion's professional privacy. The honest persistence of Dr. Watson is immediately apparent as he demonstrates why he is, by his firm and frank personality, the perfect foil to Holmes's flighty and often flamboyant genius. When the truth of Watson's investigations finally comes out, that Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective, Watson is immediately whisked along on one of his friend's cases. They fly through the dull morning to Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road to an abandoned house in which was discovered the body of a man with limbs and face contorted in the spasms of violent death, but with no wound, lying in a room splashed with blood, letters scrawled in trickling gore on the wall, a woman's wedding ring on the spattered floor, and a red candle burning in the corner. Beautiful. In calling this cryptic crimson scene a study in scarlet, Mr. Holmes's art jargon, as he calls it, may have inadvertently inspired Dr. Watson to the literary action of becoming Holmes's biographer, his Boswell, with reminiscences which would prove too romantic for Holmes's rigid views. Their debate on this point is eternal, though Mr. Holmes was pretty dramatic himself in the two tales he recorded, The Lion's Mane and The Blanched Soldier. But back to A Study in Scarlet, it is indeed a tangled skein, as the original novel was originally titled, and full of moments that have become quintessential and a pleasure to witness as occurring for the first time, such as Holmes revealing the inner man by analyzing his appearance, a famous method of observation and deduction, which was inspired originally by Doyle's medical colleague, Dr. Joseph Bell, who could identify the maladies and the professions of his patients just by looking at the clues their exteriors afforded. Also, of import and interest, Holmes was somewhat modeled after Edgar Allan Poe's creation, C. Auguste Dupin, a detective type who is arguably the father of all literary detectives, and who definitely bears a passing resemblance to Holmes. Dupin first appeared in 1841's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and that is a thumping good mystery. with a really unique twist ending, which I will not spoil. If you haven't read it, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, get on it, read it. In fact, Sherlock Holmes makes a jab at Dupin in A Study in Scarlet as a rank amateur, which is the first instance of this kind of meta quality of these stories, where they have an ability to traverse through other works of literature and even history. Did you know, for instance, that Mr. Holmes has a suspected appearance in Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera? Check that out too, if you dare. In any case, Doyle was a great lover of Edgar Allan Poe. And in honor of the centenary of Poe's birth in 1909, he said in a speech, his tales, Poe's tales, were one of the great landmarks and starting points in the literature of the last century. For those tales have been so pregnant with suggestion, so stimulating to the minds of others, that it may be said of many of them that each is a root from which a whole literature has developed. Doyle and his detective contributed to the truth of this statement. Now, I have already mentioned the terms canon and I believe sacred writings. And these are the 60 official public records of Sherlock Holmes's cases as recorded and collected by John H. Watson, MD. Yes, there are only 60 original Sherlock Holmes stories. That's it. Although, thousands of pastiches have sprung up around them. And those 60 stories are comprised of 4 novels, Study in Scarlet, The Sign of Four, The Valley of Fear, and The Hound of the Baskervilles, and 5 collections of short stories, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and His Last Bow. These stories make up the canon and are subject to what is known among Sherlockian and Holmesian scholars as the Great Game. But before we go there, we must say something first of the Great Hiatus. In 1893, after writing 2 novels and 2 collections, Arthur Conan Doyle opened his diary, recorded the rather terse entry, "Killed Holmes," and clapped the pages shut with finality. The final problem had been published in the Strand magazine, which recounted the events that plunged Sherlock Holmes to death beneath Switzerland's Reichenbach Falls, grappling his arch nemesis, Professor Moriarty. Sherlock Holmes was dead. Readers were shocked and dismayed, wore mourning bands and black veils in public, and shed tears in private over the impossible pages of the Strand. It was a total scandal. And I don't think that there would be another such reaction to a literary event until Orson Welles presented The War of the Worlds on American radio in 1938, where droves of citizens panicked, thinking it a broadcast of an actual alien invasion. Anyway, Doyle had been contemplating slaying the financial expedient he had brought to life and fame for some time. For though successful in covering the costs of living, Sherlock Holmes came with a price: time, energy, and for Doyle, drudgery. He did not care for writing Sherlock Holmes stories. And despite Holmes's immense popularity, Doyle wished to turn his energies to his real interest, which was writing historical novels like The White Company, which is perhaps his best one. But there was this terrible irony at work in all of this. For though Conan Doyle didn't care at all for Sherlock Holmes, the unscrupulous manner in which he wrote them made his writing so far from being self-conscious that they ring with an authenticity that is truly spellbinding. Nevertheless, Doyle would complain, Holmes takes my mind from better things. And also, if I had not killed Sherlock Holmes, I verily believe that he would have killed me. So, in the final problem, Doyle finally disposed of his problem and wound up Sherlock Holmes for good and all. It was not, however, good for all. The widespread anguish over Holmes's demise gave way to this widespread resentment. Again, here in Doyle's words, I was amazed at the concern expressed by the public. They say a man is never properly appreciated until he is dead, and the general protest against my summary execution of Holmes taught me how many and how numerous were his friends. You brute was the beginning of a letter of remonstrance which one lady sent me, and I expect she spoke for others beside herself. I fear I was utterly callous myself, and only glad to have a chance of opening out into new fields of imagination. But in 1901, Doyle grudgingly gave his grumbling readership The Hound of the Baskervilles, being a reminiscence of Sherlock Holmes, carefully dated as occurring before the catastrophic Reichenbach affair. The Hound of the Baskervilles arrived in serial publications, and 30,000 copies of The Strand flew from the stands. The magazine could not be printed fast enough to supply demand, as droves of devotees lined up down Southampton Street waiting to seize the publication hot off the press. Sherlock Holmes's return was received with wild enthusiasm, due in no small part to the wild events that occasioned his return, the demonic Baskerville curse. The Hound of the Baskervilles presented a unique challenge for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The challenge to match his intellectual strength against forces beyond common comprehension or even common sense, and therefore beyond common crime. Though Conan Doyle revisited supernatural themes in later Holmes stories, such as The Sussex Vampire, none compete with the compelling enormity and chilling improbability of The Hound. It's great. But great as it is, The Hound wasn't enough. The world still demanded the return of Sherlock Holmes, and Doyle still resisted. I wouldn't revive Holmes if I could, Doyle wrote, for I have had such an overdose of him that I feel towards him as I do towards pâté de foie gras, of which I once ate too much. But the widespread anguish over Holmes's demise, which was actually mounting to some death threats, was too much to bear. The Adventure of the Empty House, published in 1903, brought the human surrender and the superhuman triumph that the bereaved demanded. The world's greatest detective dodged his doom and rose from the dead, establishing him forever among the ranks of immortals. And thus it was that Mr. Sherlock Holmes, supposed dead for 3 years, in his time, not ours, reappeared suddenly to his friend and colleague in London, heralded not by an empty tomb, but by an empty house. There are very few literary giants with so lovely a resurrectional motif, at least not very many human heroes, allowing us to put aside, with all reverence, the likes of the steadfast tin soldier, Gandalf, and Aslan. Sherlock Holmes, arguably the most recognizable and renowned protagonist of all time, is a true and tremendous icon of one who exemplifies the Christian paradigms of conquering the powers of evil through truth and, yes, resurrection. To be clear, though, even though Holmes rose from the grave, so to speak, to continue his mission, he cannot be fairly called a Christ figure, but he can be called a Christian figure, despite the lack of any precise reference in the sacred writings to any particular sacred philosophy or creed he held. Arthur Conan Doyle himself was a fallen away Catholic, sadly, and an agnostic for most of his life. Sherlock Holmes is, notwithstanding, a firm believer in the good and the true, and I would say a cautious believer in the God who is goodness and truth. In other words, Holmes is not entirely a cold materialist or the inflexible devotee of scientism as his methods might suggest. Holmes is too complex a creature for such narrow observations and deductions. In fact, evidence in Dr. Watson's narratives reveals a surprising spiritual awareness and avowal, rendering Sherlock Holmes an interesting spiritual subject. And speaking of the spiritual, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had spiritual leanings himself, for which he is now famous. After he lost his son, Kingsley, in 1917 to the Spanish flu epidemic, Doyle became intensely devoted to psychic sciences, seances, and spiritualist phenomena, becoming one of the most prominent leaders of this ghostly movement of his time. It's true that he lost much of his credibility due to these haunted devotions that he had, which ranged from his credence in the famous Cottingley fairies hoax. If you've ever heard of that, it's pretty interesting. Or his fascination with Harry Houdini as a magician who Doyle thought, had a foot in both worlds somehow. But considering Doyle's interest and eventual immersion in efforts to conjure up spirits of the dead, it is not surprising that in response to the outcry against the death of Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle conceived of a conjuring to assuage the pain of his devotees. Anyway, though Mr. Holmes was not a religious man, he was, it would seem, an upholder of religion. A man of terrestrial and mechanical logic, yes, but Holmes was not unconditionally dismissive of the spiritual dimension of God or of the fiend, making even Sherlock Holmes, with a dash of Catholic imagination, a bearer of the eternal light that dispels earthly darkness, a man of some faith as well as plenty of fact. If there is any doubt in the matter, the clues to the mystery of his spiritual outlook speak clearly in certain corners of the canon. God help us, cried Mr. Holmes in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. Why does fate play such tricks with poor helpless worms? I never hear of such a case as this that I do not think of Baxter's words and say, there, but for the grace of God goes Sherlock Holmes. That's great. This classic mantra of the Christian hero rings with a steely earnestness that only Sherlock Holmes can command. Add to this gallant bit of piety the master's eloquent and existential musings, suggesting an all-knowing power that guides the course of humanity in the adventure of the cardboard box. Quote, what is the meaning of it, Watson? What object is served by this circle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to some end, or else our universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable, end quote. Finally of note is Holmes's rather beautiful meditation on the divine in the Naval Treaty as he examines a rose. There is nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion. It can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner. Our highest assurance of the goodness of Providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. All other things, our powers, our desires, our food, are all really necessary for our existence in the first instance, but this rose is an extra. Its smell and its color are an embellishment of life. not a condition of it. It is only goodness which gives extras. And so I say again that we have much to hope from the flowers. Sherlock Holmes, as a kind of Pascalian hero, if you will, is rooted in a natural sense of a higher power and the primal desire for goodness to triumph over evil. And Holmes does just this in staunch, upright English fashion. Sherlock Holmes is, you might say, the prototypical Victorian gentleman, one who holds honor and duty over all else because he is necessarily principled and not because he is necessarily paid. And there's a whole catalog of these gentleman heroes. Anthony Hopes, Rudolph Rassendyll, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Alan Quatermain, Robert Louis Stevenson's Gabriel Utterson, and John Buchan's Richard Hannay are other examples of the pragmatic, bluff Victorian gentleman hero, amateur heroes, not professional heroes, men of noble class who can afford a higher level of virtue than others and so are that much more virtuous for it. The motivation of upholding justice and decency is motivation enough for these men of action, together with the personal satisfaction of occupation and adventure. Sherlock Holmes is the archetype of this civilized, heroic category of characters, and in so doing represents and reinforces his audience's cultural convictions concerning what makes a man a gentleman and a Christian. Mr. Holmes is a self-proclaimed champion of justice, moving along the edges of civil law, guided by a natural one. And the romanticism of a Christian heroism is not lost, even in his rationalism. It makes Holmes a bold touchstone of the good. And that's good enough to merit Catholic accolades, I say. The world has always hungered for orientation. And the Canon of Conan Doyle offers a certain luminary for the modern dark age, a well-dressed and well-armed gentleman hero who fearlessly combats the perils and perpetrators of society with vigor, vim, and, most importantly, virtue. As a gentleman, Holmes frees victims from pain, though he may depart in some sense from Cardinal Newman's famous definition of the gentleman as one who never inflicts pain by being terrible to the evildoer, which Holmes is, but that's the knight in him. And we'll return to chivalry a little later. The world of 221B Baker Street is a world of genteel grit and good old-fashioned optimism, casting gaslight through the fog, and speaks to readers through fantastic, high-stepping literature to inculcate the immortal principle of human honor and human hope. In short, Sherlock Holmes is a resurrected hero for a risen people, and as such evokes the glorious grit and godly optimism of the resurrection of Christ for us who fight battles in a war that is already won. Both the reality and mystery of Easter are central to any true vision and to virtue. And Sherlock Holmes participates in both as he tracks down the agents of darkness as tirelessly as a bloodhound, as one risen from the dead, in a world where his Stradivarius sings over the din of hansom cabs, tobacco smoke curls above newspaper-littered mantelpieces, and a pistol lies in every pocket, and it is always 1895. Yes, yeah, I want to go to there. Yes, he is risen, indeed. But now, okay, on to something a little bit more serious. On to the great game, which is the practice of nerds and scholars, or nerdy scholars, of treating the existing records out of the vast career of Mr. Holmes as historical fact, okay? And using them to piece together hypotheses of biography, chronology, authenticity, authorship, all of that. And now this game was started by Father Ronald Knox. He was the first to begin what are called the writings on the writings in 1911, and it's with this beautiful little essay. It's called "Studies in the Literature of Sherlock Holmes." It's rather long. I have to read you the opening of it because it's just so wonderful. This is Father Ronald Knox getting started on the study of Sherlock Holmes. Listen to this. If there is anything pleasant in life, it is doing what we aren't meant to do. If there is anything pleasant in criticism, it is finding out what we aren't meant to find out. It is the method by which we treat as significant what the author did not mean to be significant, by which we single out as essential what the author regarded as incidental. Thus, if one brings out a book on turnips, the modern scholar tries to discover from it whether the author was on good terms with his wife. If a poet writes on buttercups, every word he says may be used as evidence against him at an inquest of his views on a future existence. On this fascinating principle, we delight to extort economic evidence from Aristophanes, because Aristophanes knew nothing of economics. We try to extract cryptograms from Shakespeare, because we are inwardly certain that Shakespeare never put them there. We sift and winnow the Gospel of St. Luke in order to produce a synoptic problem, because St. Luke, poor man, never knew the synoptic problem to exist. There is, however, a special fascination in applying this method to Sherlock Holmes, because it is, in a sense, Holmes's own method. It has long been an axiom of mine, he says, that the little things are infinitely the most important. It might be the motto of his life's work. And it is it not, as we clergymen say, by the little things, the apparently unimportant things, that we judge of a man's character. It goes on. This is such a great essay. I highly recommend it. So the great game, that's what started it. And it has developed this fascination ever since, this cheeky and charming essay to crack the case of this extraordinary man, to comb Watson's memoirs for clues, uncovering Holmes's history and his inmost character, to systematically eliminate the impossible until the truth, however improbable, remains. And now I will share with you an example written by myself in the grand style of the great game, speculating on Sherlock Holmes's birthday. Here's how it goes. Fact. Nowhere in the records of Dr. Watson is the specific birth date of Mr. Holmes given. Regarding his parents, his ancestors being country squires, as Holmes called them in the Greek Interpreter, scholars hypothesize that the master's alias during the great hiatus, Sigerson, is suggestive of his father's name being Sigurd, he being the son of Sigurd, hence Sigerson. Further, Holmes's surprising and unique use of Miss Violet Smith's first name in The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist denotes an uncommon affection for that name, which, given that Holmes had no women in his life, besides the woman, Irene Adler, but that is quite another matter, see A Scandal in Bohemia, it may well indicate that his mother's name was Violet. Furthermore, the great consulting detective's arrival upon this earth can be inferred by applying his well-known methods of observation, deduction, and analytical reasoning to the clues afforded by the Canon. In the Boscombe Valley mystery, which took place in June 1889, Mr. Holmes calls himself a middle-aged gentleman. This term is generally and historically accepted as age 35, placing his birth in 1854. Further evidence is provided in the narrative of his last bow, where Holmes is described as 60 years old in 1914, again placing his birth in 1854. Regarding the precise date of Sherlock Holmes's birth, scholars lean towards January 6th due to certain telling trifles. For, as Mr. Holmes said in The Man with the Twisted Lip, there is nothing so important as trifles. Chief among these is his notable use of Shakespeare. Mr. Holmes often weaves Shakespearean language into his own. The game's afoot, from Henry V in The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, perhaps being the most famous. But there is only one play that he quotes twice in the Chronicles of Dr. Watson. Journeys end in lovers' meetings, says Mr. Holmes, in both The Adventure of the Empty House and The Adventure of the Red Circle, quoting from Twelfth Night. It is singular that in both of these instances, Holmes says lovers' meetings, using the possessive plural, slightly misquoting the line in Act 3, Scene 3, which reads lovers' meeting, being a simple plural. But this repetition is suggestive of a fondness for the play or for the date of Twelfth Night, January 6th. The Valley of Fear furthers the thread of this reasoning when it reports Mr. Holmes as being out of sorts on the morning of January 7th, indicating a poor night's rest, possibly brought on by merrymakings held the night before, due to January 6th being Sherlock Holmes's birthday. January 6th, 1854, elementary. That probably gives you more than enough of a taste of how these studies go. And they get pretty surprising, all the way down to theories that Holmes and Moriarty were the same person, or that Watson did not write most of the case book. And for the record, I myself will not accept that Watson wrote The Mazarin Stone. No. Then there are the connections to other literary works. Bram Stoker's Dracula and the Hampstead Horror is a big one. Or even to historical events. Why Holmes never cast any interest on Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders remains a point of much contention. And this isn't going into the films, the plays, the spin-offs, the critical essays, the annotated editions, the branding, or the illustrations, though the legend of how Sidney Paget became Holmes's iconic illustrator bears telling, okay? Now, when Doyle got his contract with the Strand after the Sign of Four, he was invited to hire an illustrator. He was familiar with the work of Walter Paget, who had illustrated some of Robert Louis Stevenson's novels, and sent an invitation to him. Walter Paget read the letter and tossed it aside. But, so the story goes, his brother Sidney picked it up and sketched a picture of Sherlock Holmes that was based on his brother's appearance. He sent it into Doyle and got the job. And what a job he did. Sidney Paget defined the look of Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if you can see this. You should all be more or less familiar with his work if you know anything of Sherlock Holmes. And he defined the look of Holmes in almost every way. That is now inseparable from his appearance. It was Paget who first put the deerstalker on Holmes's head and the Inverness cape on his shoulders. Paget's work is a fantastic instance of the task, the challenge of an illustrator to bring to a character or a story what the author does not. But in any case, this brings us to our final area of consideration. How is it that one literary character with a relatively small body of source material could have such an impact, such universal appeal? What is it about Sherlock Holmes that strikes this chord with people? The answer is no less than the fact that Sherlock Holmes, lofty and larger than life though he is, affirms our common humanity. And what's more, he affirms a very particular essence of humanity as he exemplifies, even embodies that highest of human attitudes, chivalry. And in this, he towers again as a heroic Catholic figure. Despite his lack of any overt Christian faith or Christian humility, because Christianity is a bold, chivalric religion, taking joy in service, in danger, and in conquest. Arthur Conan Doyle was raised on the legends of King Arthur, steeped in knightly tales, heraldry, genealogy, and national pride, creating in this man a strong chivalric sense of honor and duty. Holmes and Watson bear a similar adherence to that venerable code of conduct as virtuous, duty-bound gentlemen, as we have discussed, fulfilling an identity that is both modern and medieval. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson hold their honor very dear, and thus are champions of the right, defenders of the wronged and weak, and avengers of evildoers, whether it is their paid employment or not, even when the cases do not involve any crime. And some there are that don't. They all clearly involve honor, gentility, and chivalry. And put simply, that is refreshing and reinforcing to the Catholic reader. In this, Sherlock Holmes stands before us as a symbol of all we have lost or never had. Those are the words of Holmes scholar Edgar W. Smith. All we have lost or never had, which is an interesting definition of a hero. Holmes is all we are not and all we would be. Intelligent, cunning, humorous, unhesitating, courageous, and powerful enough to trample down the powers of evil in the name of truth and justice. Holmes has it all: the brains, the dwelling, the gear, the comrade, the freedom, the confidence, and the intrigue that every man longs for and can connect to. He's lofty enough to be an aspiration and low enough to be believable. He is an emblem of every man's desire to be a noble righter of wrongs, to be a gentleman and a hero. All this to say, Holmes gets at a substratum of what it means to be human, capturing the reserve and readiness of humanity, that quality that makes us sit at our hearth or discover the South Pole. Holmes is a homebody and an adventurer. Holmes is an intellectual force and a physical force. He satisfies a fantasy of manhood and what man can accomplish. And Catholics especially should have similar ambitions, energies, and ideals to find the truth, condemn crime, be loyal and persevering, stand on the side of light, but know how to traverse the darkness and be a help to those in need. Sherlock Holmes is a gentleman hero for our times because he is a tangible titan, someone we can identify with and idolize at the same time, one that lives in a very comprehensible flat but labors in an incomprehensible field, bringing excitement to commonplace existence and exercise for stagnant intellects. And the wonderful part is that Holmes takes us along on his exploits and breaks us free of a mundane life, reminding us that life is, in fact, laced with mystery, at once providing an otherworldly escape that opens our eyes to the world. Again, Sherlock Holmes personifies all we long for and all we have at our fingertips. We share his adventures and are left with hearts hopefully bent on seeking our own in our own sphere, which may not mean leaping after dangerous criminals, but it should mean having a new eye, an attitude, an aptitude for the whole wild world and the curious people we meet in it to see and observe. There is something of the chivalric spirit or Catholic sanguinity in the Sherlock Holmes stories because they are about the ability of man to rise above failure and ignorance by using our faculties undauntedly to become agents of truth, goodness, and justice. Or to hold Holmes up to a classical paradigm, he is something like Aristotle's magnanimous man, acting well in accordance with circumstance, accepting honor when it is due, facing danger, shunning pettiness, and with a prideful spirit, but only because he is great and deserving of admiration. High and perhaps haughty as Holmes is, Doyle's detective brings us home to a greatness that lies in all of us and into a real, though idealized world of good conquering evil in flashing episodes that are at once comfortable and exciting and eminently relatable and eminently readable. The familiarity that these tales afford is like the familiarity of an old friend, enlivened inexpressibly by two of the greatest friends in the whole catalog of famous friends. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson's companionship is as quintessential as that of Achilles and Petros, Robin Hood and Little John, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, but the sanctuary Holmes and Watson inhabit is less epic than Troy and less paradisial than Sherwood Forest and less visionary than the roads of Spain. It is more intimate and convivial in a way, like a gaslit club or something, which enhances our reverence for Holmes and our affection for Watson, according to the reverential and affectionate mysteries of friendship. This pair serves as an epitome of what friendship is, because they complement and complete each other with that mutual dedication for which death is not too great a price to pay. Holmes and Watson are as strong and warm as hearthside irons, and a refreshing retreat into a reality that can still be realized, where men can be committed as comrades in arms, loyal to their sex and to each other, locked shoulder to shoulder against the forces that threaten to unravel civilized society. The relevance of Holmes and Watson as friends is that their friendship is eternal, and they demonstrate the universal principle of friendship with unabashed dignity and grace. And such friendship is a mystery, indeed, too deep of a mystery nowadays. Only a master detective can disperse such shadows, and it is the footsteps of our times that should echo on 221B's 17 steps and knock at the door, seeking illumination. The Sherlock Holmes stories give a new meaning, I think, to the term light literature. And then there is that other mystery that is very personal to all of us, which is part of the reason why people are so drawn to mysteries, and in particular to murder mysteries. Over half of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries involve murder, and the murder mystery is as old as murder. When the blood of Abel cried out for justice, the all-seeing judge took up the case, and Cain was caught in his crime. So it was, and so it is. All are Cain, to one extent or another, murdering what is precious in our own lives. And this is getting at a theological or existential implication regarding murder mysteries. The most shocking thing about murder mysteries is that they not only reveal who the murderer is, but what the murderer is. The mystery of life is discovered in the mystery of murder. For life is like a murder mystery, peppered with conundrums of the utmost moment, where every person is a detective tracking down the loss of innocence, happiness, friendship, holiness, these things that make life meaningful, but are so often slain. In more cases than not, the detective finds himself the murderer, beset as most are with sins they hardly see. And if they did, they would rather be blind. Thus, Sophocles wrote, "The greatest griefs are those we cause ourselves," and his tragedy of Oedipus is a prototype of this principle of mystery and murder. For it does not present a case where the detective solves the mystery, but rather a case where the mystery solves the detective, revealing something essential and terrible and exciting in all of us. We all have to get to the bottom of ourselves. And the aberrations and solutions of murder mysteries evokes the mystery of our own iniquity, our awe of justice, and our hope for mercy. Perhaps the greatest instance of the humanizing fallibility of the detective can be read in a book called Trent's Last Case by E.C. Bentley. It's a truly great mystery, perhaps the best of them all. I say with hesitation, but it's good. And just to mention it, as a unique instance of a man actually trying to solve the mystery of his own murder, I challenge all of you to read The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. In these ways, the mystery of man is drawn out by murder, pointing to the tragedy that man is but an ephemeral, imperfect creature, dangling on the whims of fate and the wiles of felons, subject to unthinkable forces, lost in a puzzle of perplexing terror. And when the discovery of personal murder, we might call it mortal sin, of unspeakable self-inflicted loss is made, there ought to be horror and the fearless determination to get to the bottom of it. And when people solve the crimes they have committed, facing their own weakness and guilt, they are then faced with a very different kind of murder plot, a death to self. Surrendering to the reality of human imperfection, accepting the responsibility of being the murderer of our own good, but resolving to do more good than the good we have destroyed. Though many act in ignorance and even innocence, there is an inherent fault that all must own up to sooner or later. Self-sufficiency and self-importance are ever lurking assassins. There is within every man that incriminating drop of pride, that damning footprint of original sin, whose owner must be hunted down, apprehended, and converted. Sherlock Holmes makes us all detectives and agents of decency and dignity in an analogous or symbolic or psychological or even spiritual sense. Murder mysteries play with the power that people possess to challenge and change the course of history and salvation, and express the case we are all on to solve the mystery of our own murders. As any detective knows, what is imperative is not what fate has in store, but what one does when it is discovered. Knowledge of the problem is, in the end, not as important as the knowledge of its solution. The solution may not be as intriguing as the problem, a point Agatha Christie often reverses, but it is a realization of reality. The trial of suffering and the balm of hope. The mystery of the human being must shine through the most gruesome murder and replace destruction with creation. For murder cries out with the mystery of immortality. G.K. Chesterton's unassuming Father Brown pushes the paradigm that every murder mystery must result in the discovery of both crime and redemption, where the sin is never as significant as the sinner. Sherlock Holmes's mysteries invite us to this same discovery, to this same inquiry, and with all the calm and confidence of the gentleman hero. In this, even fictional figures like Sherlock Holmes are heavenly figures. Fellows, we hope somehow to meet at that mysterious inn at the end of the world, or as Conan Doyle put it. One likes to think that there is some fantastic limbo for the children of imagination, some strange, impossible place where the bow of Fielding may still make love to the bells of Richardson, where Scott's heroes still may strut, Dickens's delightful cockneys still raise a laugh, and Thackeray's worldlings continue to carry on their reprehensible careers, perhaps in some humble corner of such a Valhalla, Sherlock and his Watson may for a time find a place, while some more astute sleuth with some even less astute comrade may fill the stage which they have vacated. Whether more or less astute, that new sleuth is all of us, challenged to take up the good mantle of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson with all the confidence and courage that they were given. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle gave the world 60 Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but more importantly, he gave the world the mystery of Sherlock Holmes, and thereby the chance for that poetic awakening to solve the mystery of our own murders, our own lives, and our own salvation. Come, the game's afoot.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, thank you so much. What an exciting evening together. What an entertaining way to dive into these mysteries and to see what they have in store for us. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and for teaching us this evening on this. We have Michelle writing in a question, and I think it's a great question to start with, probably one that many have. We have a couple in this similar category. Mr. Fitzpatrick, for someone who has never read Sherlock Holmes, where do you recommend they start? Are there certain editions that you recommend? What's your base? What's your jumping off for Sherlock?
All right. Well, you really should read A Study in Scarlet first. That's the first novel. It's not very long, but that's the place to start. The other thing that you really got to do is you have to get this edition. This is not a hard edition to find. This has got 3 of the collections: The Adventures, The Memoirs, The Return, and The Hound of the Baskervilles. And the reason why it's published by Castle Books, it's readily available. You could find it very easily. This red cover is easy to find. But the reason why it's a great edition is, I don't know if you can see this, it's laid out in the original layout of the Strand magazine. So you can read the stories as people read them for the first time, with the same size and typeface, all the original illustrations by Sidney Paget. This is a great one. So Study in Scarlet, get your hands on this one. This edition is great. If you really want to dive in, you could get one of these. This is a double volume. These are all 60 stories. This is a very famous annotated edition by William Baring Gould, and they're great. It's like this is a course in Sherlock Holmes right here. William S. Baring Gould. He also wrote this really wonderful book, one of the many biographies of Sherlock Holmes, and it's a wonder. It's a wonder of imaginative literary criticism, really. And as far as go-to stories, once you've done A Study in Scarlet, you would do well to turn to the story that Arthur Conan Doyle himself thought was his best story, which was The Speckled Band. He thought that one was really good, and it is. It's not my favorite. It's good. I think my favorite Sherlock Holmes story is The Adventure of the Second Stain. So there's that. And maybe right after that, I would have to put The Six Napoleons. Right after that, The Red-Headed League, The Abbey Grange, Silver Blaze. I better stop. But there are some recommendations. Second Stain, read that one after Study in Scarlet.
Great, thank you so much. For those of you that were hurriedly trying to write all of those links down, we will give some in the follow-up email. Also, some people are writing in to ask about a link for the Father Knox writing. We will also give that a link in the email so that you guys have a way to find those and do some further study. Gordon on screen, why don't you go ahead and take yourself off of mute and ask your question?
Oh, yes, Mr. Fitzpatrick. My question is simply this. Do you think that Sherlock Holmes served as a redemptive character for Dr. Watson. I've always wondered that when I read Sherlock Holmes, because there is always there's a tension that's there. I'm not saying that Sherlock Holmes is greater than or bigger than Watson, but there seems to be that redemptive thing that goes on there.
Are you asking, did Watson profit personally from his association with Mr. Holmes?
Yes, but more in terms of a redemptive character rather than just, a work relationship.
Well, it's certainly the case that Dr. Watson loved Sherlock Holmes, even though, yeah, they had a working relationship, and Holmes, he puts Watson down at times. It's always, Holmes is a hard man to get along with. I imagine he's very eccentric and very, very aware of his superiority. So I imagine he was a hard companion to live with, but Watson consistently shows not only tremendous regard for Holmes's talents, but Holmes's safety. He was very instrumental in freeing Holmes of his habit of using cocaine, which he used, and maybe some morphine too, which he would use to kind of shut his mind off when he didn't have work. But he developed a habit using those drugs, which I understand were not illegal at the time in London, but Watson saw them as destroying this beautiful mind that he had, and was very encouraging and helpful to Holmes in that. And so, insofar as he was a help to Mr. Holmes, not only professionally but very much personally as well, I think that Watson did have a kind of redemptive relationship, that he was made a better man, a more hopeful man, and a fulfilled man due to his associations with Mr. Holmes. So,
thank you. Good.
We have a question coming in, a couple questions on the back. Tom writing in, and someone else, so I'm going to group it a little bit, asking, do you think there are any adaptations, either like in a play or a movie, any of those, that actually capture the same vision that Doyle originally penned? Or do you
Sure.
think that the adaptations, any one of them specifically, go in their own direction, or any that you recommend that are true to what was being written?
Sure, there are so many. I've only scratched the surface of the imitative writings. I've read some there. One title that I'll mention, which is kind of hailed as the best Sherlock Holmes pastiche, being the most true to his character, and almost a story that people want to include in the canon, is called The 7% Solution. Hang on one second. I'm just going to grab it off my shelf, just because I can't remember the name of the author, but he knows what he's doing. Yes, Nicholas Meyer, The 7% Solution. That's a good pastiche. It's a little novel, as you can see here. It's very good. As far as other adaptations, I mean, immediately dramatic presentations, films come to mind. I think that there are more Sherlock Holmes films than almost any other character, I dare say. But my favorite, I think the best, is the series produced in the 80s by Granada Television, British outfit, starring Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes. Super good, super good. You've got Edward Hardwicke as Watson in some of the episodes. I can't remember the name, David something as Watson in some of the others, but Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes is astonishing. He is sad to say, he kind of lost his mind playing Sherlock Holmes, because he was so dedicated and devoted and lost himself in the character to the point of losing his mental health. But so maybe it's kind of a hard series to recommend, since it was the downfall in a way of a man. But he is astonishing as Holmes, and all of those episodes are very readily available on YouTube. Of course, there was a lot of hype in recent years over the BBC production Sherlock, which is a modern revisioning of Sherlock Holmes, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and can't remember the other guy who played Watson right now, but those are very, very good. However, I always hesitate to recommend those because they are so steeped and laced with references to the canon that it's almost a shame to watch them if you're not a student of these works. It's almost like recommending like the finest wine to somebody who knows nothing about wine. And that doesn't mean you can't watch them and enjoy them for the merits that are attainable, but they are extraordinary works of reference and nods and winks and Easter eggs. I mean, there's every minute of those episodes has some reference to the original Sherlock Holmes stories in a way that's truly mind-boggling. I can barely watch the series because I'm just always like, oh my gosh, did they just say that? Wait a minute, stop. Like, I can't believe they made that reference. At that point, they were written by the guy who plays Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock Holmes's brother. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but he is clearly a major aficionado in the literature of Sherlock Holmes. So I recommend that series, and though I recommend it more to people who have made something of a study of Sherlock Holmes, which, by the way, is a very pleasant thing to do. This might sound kind of ridiculous or shocking, but I dedicated a year of my life just reading Sherlock Holmes. That's the only thing I read for a whole year. And I read all the stories, and so it was crazy. My wife still remembers that year, but because I would just talk about Sherlock Holmes way too much. But it was so fun to just, because it's a whole world, it's a whole universe that you can totally just get lost in, and it's worth it. It's worth it. I mean, even though it's fiction, and it might sound like, inviting someone to get lost in some sort of fantasy world, it's just so laced with excellent writers. Writers not only Father Knox, but Andrew Lang and G.K. Chesterton, and these good Catholic authors and critics who've given themselves to this because it's so delightful, and it really does have so much in it of human goodness and virtue and an opportunity to solve a puzzle. So even though it might sound crazy, I do recommend just giving yourself over to Sherlock Holmes and the essays, the criticisms, and the pastiches, the biographies. They are very enriching. It's a very rewarding experience, crazy as that may sound.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, kind of piggybacking on that, we have someone writing in asking about all of this reading and recommendations. What is your favorite non-canon story that you would recommend?
I guess I would have to say the 7% Solution again. Although, you could get into the Mazarin Stone, and there's a lot of dubious contestants in there about whether they're canonical or not. Some of them are pretty interesting, but 7% Solution is worth a read as someone who as an effort of someone who has really studied and made a very strong and honest effort to expand the literature. But as I said, there are so many canonical or non-canonical works. I've barely scratched the surface of them. I gave myself more to the critical essays and analyses of the original 60 more than I did to the pastiches. However, I did write several myself in that year. I think I wrote about 7 or pastiches that were based on these kind of scintillating little references in the stories of other cases that we don't have. Like, this, maybe the most famous one is when Holmes says, oh yes, I remember that ship. That was at the time when we were investigating the strange case of the giant rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet sufficiently prepared. Whoa, what's that? It's good stuff.
Thank you so much. What an entertaining evening that we've had here together tonight. We're so grateful for the time that you've taken to be with us and spend such a great evening in entertainment and in a break from the world to enter into this world of literature together. So thank you so much for the time that you've taken with us. If you would please close us in prayer this evening, we would be so grateful.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, how about we say the St. Michael prayer, since that kind of goes along with some of these chivalric and heroic qualities of waging war against the foe. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who wander through the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.